Hello and welcome back to the Talia Chester YouTube channel. When you have a look at top level players playing their games of chess, you quite often see a couple patterns emerging. The main ones being the same openings coming up over and over again. As we can see here, if we have a look at this board here, about 99% of games that you'll see will start with one of the same four moves. E4 is the most common one, about 50% of games start with E4. About 35-40% start with D4. And about 10% start with the move c4 or knight to f3. Depends on who is playing. However, in my opinion, there is a very interesting move that is often overlooked at top level play, and it means that a lot of people at lower levels don't ever end up really playing it because they don't see their big favourite players playing it. And that move is f4. F4 is called the bird's opening, or the bird opening, or the bird defense. I think I've heard a couple of people say. I call it the birds, just it's the easiest one for me to call it. And it is quite a strange opening. Now, one of the first things you'll notice about this move here, it does not control these center squares particularly well. It doesn't have one of the pawns in the center squares. We can see the same with a move like knight to f3 or c4. Neither of those put pawns in center, but the point is with those moves is that we quite often see pawns going into those center squares anyway, and you can kind of transpose into other positions. Whereas the aim in the move f4 is you never really see pawns getting put into the center squares at all. Instead, what we try and do is we're trying to attack them from the outside. Another thing you'll notice is that no pieces are helped developed by playing the move f4. You can see that the bishop here is going to be more blocked in over here, and it's going to be very difficult for the pieces to develop in any way around this f4 pawn. And finally, you'll also notice that the diagonals facing towards the king are significantly weakened, which basically will make you think, wow, this is an opening that I would want to play. However, in my opinion, this is actually one of the best openings that you can play, especially at a lower level. And I know exactly what people are going to say, but we'll come to it in a second. So why do I love the move f4 as an opening? Well, first of all, is that there's very little variations to try and memorize. There's actually only really two. One of them is playing standardly by playing moves like d5, c5, and then just kind of developing as standard. And the other one is the From's Gambit, which is when they play e5. And that one you have to memorize a little bit of theory for. The second reason why I enjoy this opening is because it's played in, at least master games, about 0.2% of the time. Like, it's so rare that you basically never see it. And it means that when you're playing against your opponent, it's very likely that they have not seen this opening before. So, it means basically whatever happens is you're going to have the edge on preparation from them, because you will have played this opening many, many, many times before. It's also a very aggressive opening. Obviously, the bishop, the diagonals are opened up for bishops and queens. We can kind of defend against that a little bit later on. So let's have a look at what we do with this opening. Okay, so f4 is the most common move, is the move that we're playing, and d5 is the most common response. And the idea that we're going to try and go for is we're going to try and cover these two squares without actually putting any pawns into the center. With the ideas of stuff like knight to f3, they might try and take control center with c5, so this is a very common idea. And then e3, and we're controlling these two center squares with both of the pawns. After continued development, we might get a position like this, and we've fianchetted our bishop onto the queen's side. There's a couple of different variations of the bird that you can play, but this is the one that I like to play personally, with the idea of just trying to get ultra controlling over these squares here. You can see that all of our pieces are facing towards these squares, and the only thing that they've got on the board that's facing towards it is this knight over here. Now, the black bishop has a couple of different places it can move to here. This is a very common one, just pinning the piece, and here you can just pin their knight back. You don't really need to worry about this knight being pinned too much. With the idea being that you actually can just take this knight, and after they take back, not only have you got even better control of these squares, but this bishop here, your light square bishop in this opening doesn't actually do too much, so it's actually sometimes quite beneficial to just trade it off for this knight, because this knight generally is a little bit of a thorn in the side. But also they can play bishop to here, and here you've got a couple of different options of what you might want to play. I play bishop to e2 most of the time, but you can also just play bishop to b5. That's a little bit easier to remember. So I'll have a look at bishop to b5, because simply trading here with the bishop is completely fine. There's nothing wrong with this. Another good thing about this opening is it's very difficult to mess up. You can play many different moves and just end up in an equal position, I normally find, so you don't need to worry too much. If we continue the opening, we can see castling on the king side of the board here. We've kind of tried to block off this diagonal. It can be a little bit scary, so I understand why a lot of people kind of avoid this because of this diagonal being quite weak. But what we basically have got into now is like this middle game section here. We can also just trade this off. This is fine. I might as well just trade it now. But normally we can kind of wait until it either gets kicked out of the way by the pawn or the queen. And here we kind of into this setup, a bit like London, kind of. Not in the same like opening vein, but all in the kind of way that we've kind of reached this position without really thinking too much. We kind of know that the position we're going to end up in has these pieces in this specific place, and we don't really need to change that. So we can play this relatively quickly whilst our opponent is still thinking on their time. So there's been games that I've played that have lasted for like a couple hours. But I've had to spend about 2 minutes in the opening, where they've had to spend about half an hour trying to get their pieces developed and making sure they're not blundering. So it's a really good advantage of this opening. And in this position, we basically have a couple of ideas that we want to kind of go through. And it's the same kind of the 3-4 ideas in this opening that we kind of just go, hey, which one of these do you want to do? And we kind of work out from it. The first of which is by plonking your knight in that very centre square. And it's such a nice outpost here. You're basically attacking all of the squares in the black position that are useful. You're attacking this bishop here. And it's just a very nice piece to have directly in the centre. They might castle, for example, and then we can start trying to bring other pieces involved. We could obviously take the bishop if you want to, but we could also try and get our other pieces into game. And the second idea that we have is bringing our queen over to this g3 square. And we start off by playing queen e1, which looks a little bit odd to start off with, but we can kind of transfer our queen over to this g3 square. After they develop, let's say, rook to c8, we would then play the move over to here. And we are then attacking this square here. And it's a very common thing in openings like in the birds for your opponent to kind of forget there's a threat going on here. So let's say if we just go back here and we play this idea first, for example, of playing the queen over to here. This square here looks obviously very weak here, and especially at lower levels, you'll very often see, I mean, even at high levels, I've seen this a couple of times, someone playing the knight into here and just blundering checkmate in one. So it's a very simple trick that you kind of just do to win quite a few games there, of people just not noticing this is on the board. But this is still a good place to have the queen anyway. It's still continuing on with the attack, and we can bring our knight into this square here. Another thing we can do in the opening, so let's go to this position here. Let's say here we've brought the knight here, and they've decided to exchange off here. It wouldn't be exactly in this position, but this is still kind of the right idea. And the knight comes into this square here. So the knight's coming to this square, and I'm just going to exchange this off so it doesn't say it's a massive blunder. This knight moving to here is actually a big mistake. Normally it wants to be moving backwards, because actually this knight, despite it not looking like it, is going to get trapped. If we just play the move d3, the knight can't move to here or here because of the pawn. Can't move back here because of the pawn in the way. Bishops and knight stops that square. Queen stops that square. Rook stops that square. And the pawn stops that square. The only available move to play is the move knight to g5. And then this pawn here just simply makes this knight not be able to move anywhere. It can't move to any of these squares. So you just simply win a knight in that position. So these are very common things that kind of just happen because people don't know the position well enough. But if you know the position, these become a lot more natural to you. So anyway, let's go back to takes, and then knight into the center, castles, queen over. We play it move like this. Another idea, we might notice that this knight is our final piece to not get developed, and you might think that you want to move your knight onto c3. However, this is not quite the case, purely because it blocks this bishop in, and they can start playing moves like d4, which look a bit risky. So what we can play is move like, hold on, so I've got to play a move for black. Let's play a6, for example. So they might try and start an attack down this side. A move like d3 here works as well. And you just try and bring your knight into this f3 square to support this knight. And what you can actually do in the end is, for example, if they play something like this, we can start exchanging the knight for the bishop. And then we can bring the other knight into this square instead. And this kind of is your kind of general vibe of the opening. There is also the option earlier on, if you're looking for a slightly different kind of play style, to play a move like c4 at some point. So I think c4 and then knight to here can sometimes work. It depends on the position. So you kind of, this is one of the more rare ones. I don't normally play this one myself. But you kind of normally bring your knight into a square like a3 and then try and exchange off here. So in the Birds opening, I just think it's a incredibly good opening, an incredibly solid one to kind of start off with. And you always have these kinds of attacks of trying to bring your queen over to squares like here, attacking down here, and basically all of your pieces here are doing something useful, and you always have the ideas of pushing moves like f5 to try and break apart your position and get your pieces onto this open file, semi-open file when it comes to it. And I just think this opening is actually quite simple to learn for beginners. People think that it's a bit weird, but I think it's quite simple. One of the reasons why people think that the birds shouldn't be played by beginners is because there was this long-standing move in the opening, which is after f4 they might play e5, and this is called the Franz Gambit, and this can lead to a lot of risks. And it means that at beginner levels, like you can feel like you have to actually learn some theory. However, it's not too difficult to end up in an okay position here. So you can see here, the idea is that they are trying to sacrifice a pawn here. And the idea is they've got very open lines in the center here. And there's a very famous story about the birds opening of a Russian grandmaster teaching all their students to play the birds opening, and then their opponents playing this line, and then all of them playing the move knight to c3 and losing it with a checkmate in 3 moves. With the idea being queen captures, queen plays to h4, attacking the king. The move g3 is forced, and because there's 2 attackers here and only 1 defender, queen sacrifice here. You can also take the bishop, but it's more stylish to take the queen, and then takes here, and that is checkmate. So when the when the school children learned that was what they did, they had to do a different plan. And then they played something like knight to f3 or something like that. And then they played some other moves, and they still managed to get the exact same checkmate going on. But it's quite a famous story to learn here. However, there is a line that works perfectly fine here. So you've kind of ended up in this position where they've got their very open lines, and we are playing as white. So knight to f3 here, just standard development, stopping the queen from coming into here. And the move that is quite common to see is the move g5. This is called the Lasker variation. And basically the plan is here that you're going to try and kick this knight out of the way. You're going to end up in a little bit of a strange position here. The move g3 is what I recommend, kind of letting that knight get kicked out of the way. And then after the knight comes to h4, you can they might play something like knight to e7, and they're just trying to get rid of this knight out of the way. And then you develop in the center, and they're going to try and exchange this off. Now the best move here is normally to take the knight here. However, I think it's a bit risky. I don't think there's a reason to go for that because it opens up this the rook file over here. So just playing back knight to g2, and you've ended up moving your knight quite a few times this opening, but you are just a pawn up. And if you just continue developing here like quite standardly, so you've played this move here, playing the move bishop to e3 is quite important, so you can drop the bishop back to f2 if need be. But here you can kind of just develop quite standardly. I might play a move like knight to c6. You might play something like knight to c3, and we just kind of continue on with standard development, and they can't really do much if you just castle this side instead of castling on the king side. And basically, you're just a pawn up. Your opponent might spend a little bit more time on it, but the thing is that unlike most openings where you spend a lot of time, you kind of end up in an equal position. If you spend a lot of time in this opening and work things out, you will be fine. There's nothing wrong here. You're just a clean pawn up, and you don't need to worry too much. And if you just have a long time to think about your moves, it's not going to be that difficult. And if you're playing fast, your opponent still probably doesn't really know what they're doing. There's been so many times where I've entered this opening variation here, and I've got to this point, and the opponent's just not really knowing what to do because they only know that you sacrifice on here, and then they play some other move. Just as a little bit of a warning, though, if they do play the move bishop to g4. We're going to play the move e3, just so we can take back with the queen. This is one that I always still forget, playing d4, and then if they capture, and we capture back, they're going to check over here. And we can't block it because of takes, and queen takes over here. So just be careful of that extra thing there. Just play the move e3 just to protect the knight. But other than that, there's not really many other variations that they can play. You might end up in a situation where they play the move, for example, g6, and that can feel a bit that's normally not great for us because it's now going to be attacking on the same diagonal that we're attacking on, and that's not a lot of fun. In this situation, you can play moves like knight to c3 and then develop your bishop, and that's perfectly fine. You can kind of continue on your own plan. Personally, I just play d4, and I know it's not. This is now no longer a bird's opening. Really, you kind of just go into a stonewall structure. But again, this is not that difficult to play. You've ended up with really solid pawns. Their bishop's now blocked in. And you can play moves like knight to d2 and queen to e2, bishop here, and then backwards, and then you try and push that center square there, and you're in a fine position. There's nothing wrong with this. So you kind of have to learn a couple lines, but I'll be honest with you, 99% of games that you'll see will have the exact same plans that I said just then, of playing moves like this. Bishop comes out to here, bishop comes out to here, or bishop goes into there. You have the exact same ideas in like probably about, I'd say about 80% of your games, and you kind of end up in the structure that you're a lot more familiar with than your opponent is. So yeah, you just kind of end up a little bit like this, and you're fine basically here. So that is the bird's opening for you. Obviously, starting off with f4. It will very much surprise a lot of your opponents, so I do recommend giving this a go if you've never tried it before, and giving a couple games with it to try and test yourself and see if you've learned anything from this video. But thank you very much for this, for tuning in today. If you did like the video, please leave a comment, subscribe, and obviously like the video. So thank you very much for joining us today, and I very much appreciate it. And if you do use the bird, comment down below on how you found it. But that is all for today. Thank you very much, and I will see you later. Bye-bye.